Podcast Spainsif, plataforma de referencia de la inversión sostenible en España.
Welcome to Podcast Spainsif, an open space for dialoguing about sustainable and responsible investment, where it will be possible to be updated on the novelties, innovation and trends on sustainable finance in Spain. For this occasion, together with Stephen Horter, which is the Global Head of ESG at Allianz Global Investors and a member of the Technical Expert Group for the EU Commission Action Plan in Sustainable Finance. Welcome, Stephen. Thank you so much for participating in our series at Podcast on Sustainable Benchmarking. In this podcast, we will be looking into the current status of EU climate benchmarks in terms of their ambition, objectives, potential users, and future challenges regarding all this. So let's begin. Stephen, the Technical Expert Group has developed 2 climate-related EU benchmarks so far. Why is this part of the Action Plan for Sustainable Finance, and who might be using these and for what kind of purpose?
Yes, thank you for that question, and thanks for having me for this podcast, Andrea. My big pleasure to speak to Spainsif and record it to its audience. So the 2 climate benchmarks are paramount in the sense that they support climate-conscious investing and which is a big objective, as you know, by the European Union to build a climate resilient, climate neutral economy that also goes to the capital market. And the benchmarks can be used with different purposes. So first and foremost, as you said, they support investors and asset owners to meet climate investment objectives. And then they can be used either for investment purposes, for performance benchmarks, or even as insights for engagement. So they are a common important tool that meets high ambitious standards in line with EU environmental objectives.
So, what are the key differences between these 2 kind of EU benchmarks in terms of climate that have been developed? There is the EU Transition Benchmark and the EU Paris Agreement Aligned Benchmark. So, what are the differences?
Correct. So maybe let me first start with the commonalities. Yeah. So first of all, it's correct. We have 2 types of climate benchmarks. So the one is called the EU Climate Transition Benchmark, and the other is called the EU Paris Aligned Benchmark. So the commonalities, first of all, is that they both are aimed to a decarbonization trajectory in line with the International Panel for Climate Change 1.5 degree global warming scenario. So the climate scenario we use is a global warming of 1.5 degree, and then the implicit decarbonization path investments must take implicitly to meet it. So that's the commonality. The difference as such are mostly also not on the ongoing self-decarbonization of the benchmarks. So both, again, aim for 1.5 degrees global warming, and the self-decarbonization of the on a portfolio level of the 2 benchmarks is 7 percentage points year over year. That's derived from the IPCC 1.5 degree decarbonization trajectory. Now we come to the differences. So the climate transition benchmark reduces immediately the carbon footprint by 30% to a comparable investment universe, typically a traditional market index. And the Paris-aligned benchmark is even more aggressive. It reduces the carbon footprint by 50%, so by half, versus a comparable investment universe / often the traditional market index. So the Paris-aligned benchmark is more aggressive from a climate neutrality perspective. And as said, the commonality is that they both aim at a continuous decarbonization of 7% in line with the decarbonization trajectory of the IPCC 1.5 degree path. So that's the big framework, and that's the commonalities and the differences.
Okay, thank you. And what are the next steps, and how will it look like in the market adoption of this EU climate benchmark?
Mm-hmm. So what is the nature, what we did at the technical expert group? So we built a recommendation report around those climate benchmarks, to be precise, the minimum requirements for those benchmarks. So what the EU wants is to create climate benchmark standards. That's what you can see in the tech report. Now there are two steps, so to say. The one immediate next step from a more formal perspective is, so to say, the putting it into law. And here the European Commission has published a DA by 8th of April, so a directive which sets more or less like the amendment to the benchmark regulation, which also includes then mostly the recommendations by the tech. Now, if you are interested, you can access that text and you can input to the EU Commission until the 6th of May, so rather short term. Now, beyond, so to say, the amendment of the benchmark regulation with respect to those minimum requirements for EU climate benchmarks, there is already voluntary market adoption. So some of the larger benchmark providers have committed to apply the minimum requirements as recommended by the tech, provisional on to what's happening now in the delegated act, in the legal process. So they already voluntarily changed their benchmarks in line with those minimum standards. Also, there's happening innovation. So you find benchmark providers who use the tech recommendations on those climate benchmarks, whether it's climate transition benchmark or Paris aligned, to innovate their climate benchmarks. So there's going to be more offering. So what's happening there is that there is more supply of benchmarks, different asset classes, so mostly on the equity side right now. What we are still looking for is, of course, more types of climate benchmarks on the fixed income side, because that's where a lot of money sits. We are very confident. The feedback we've received so far is that those recommendations make sense. And as said, it's voluntary standards that needs to be put out very precise. So benchmark providers may, but don't have to necessarily refer to those requirements. But what we can see is already a voluntary adoption, even ahead of closing the delegated act.
This is so very interesting. We will be delighted to see how it looks like in the next months. Thank you so much, Stephen, for participating in this Spainsif podcast and sharing with us all this relevant information on EU benchmarking, contributing, of course, to a climate-neutral economy from the capital market. So thank you for such an interesting and first-hand point of view. For more information in the Eurozone Spainsif, we have linked to the final documents published by the tech on the final report and guidelines on the EU climate benchmarks. Thank you, Stephen, for joining us, and thank you also for listening, and let's meet again in other Spainsif podcasts on the series of sustainable benchmarking.
Thanks very much, Andrea. My big pleasure.
Podcast Spainsif, plataforma de referencia de la inversión sostenible en España.